Ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to this second anniversary event of the Mason Institute. My name is Graham Laurie from Edinburgh Law School. I'm the director of the Institute, and before handing over to the very capable hands of our chair for this evening, Alistair Kent, I just wanted to give you a little bit of an update on the work that we've been doing in Mason Institute since it was established in 2012. Our banner here, I think, says everything you need to know about our vision and our mission statement and what we're trying to achieve. We established the Mason Institute in honour of our colleague John Kenyon Mason, who was the Professor of Forensic Medicine in Edinburgh University from 1974 to 1985, and then came across to the law school to teach medical law with a few of us up until a few years ago, and he knows much more about the law than many lawyers. And Ken's sort of spirit of intellectual inquiry, his openness to learning and his commitment to contributing to public life is exactly what we're trying to do in the Mason Institute to honour him and his contributions. Unfortunately, Ken can't be with us here this evening, but he remains fully committed to our work in contributing to research, teaching and public engagement. And indeed, just last week, members of the Executive Committee of the MI put in some written evidence to the Scottish Parliamentary Health and Sport Committee on assisted suicide. I'm sure many of you know that there's an assisted suicide proposal before the Scottish Parliament at the moment, and Ken was a full and active member of that written proposal. Anybody who's interested in that can find out more on our website. So just to give you a little bit of an update, what's happened in the course of the last 2 years. Well, we completed a report today for the School of Law on our activities. We can now say that there are over 150 members of the Mason Institute, both within Edinburgh University, other academic institutions and far beyond. We are very proud of a series of collaborations, not only in medicine and life sciences as our name would suggest, but also with government, policymakers, dancers, artists and fiction writers. Indeed, one of our colleagues in the Executive Committee, Sean Harman, has produced in the course of last year a graphic novel looking at legal and ethical issues related to our work, and that's freely available on our website if you're at all interested. In terms of projects, we've actually been able to generate around £2.8 million worth of funding for ongoing projects, and we're absolutely delighted about that. And there are two people beyond the Executive Committee who have been very instrumental in those successes to date. And these are the people who have occupied the role of our research and development officers. The first such person was Patricia Murray, who came on board from 2012 to just last year, before she decided to pursue her own private business in helping families who have twins and supporting them in that respect. And more recently, we are delighted to welcome to our team Elizabeth Barlow, who is the new Research and Development Officer. And one of Elizabeth's first roles since she took over that position has been to undertake the revamp of our website. So this is just a holding page about what you can expect in the coming weeks, but it gives you some sort of flavour about what we're up to, including these contributions with all the different collaborators that I mentioned before. And just one example of that in terms of art and ethics is this wonderful exhibit that was launched 2 months ago involving our colleagues Jill Haddo and Sean Harman, who were involved in a collaboration with an artist, Astrid Eichel, looking at the experiences of patients with respect to implantable smart technologies. And it's really in continuing that theme that we have come to the topic this evening, in terms of experience, and particularly the patient experience. The Mason Institute is committed to listening to voices that have something important to say. And despite all the connections that I've already sort of laid out for you this evening, there are still many voices out there that are harder to hear or perhaps easier to ignore, and the patient voice is one of those. So what we want to do this evening is to explore just what exactly is the value of that experiences and the experiences of patients and publics more broadly. So that's all I want to say. I'm going to hand over to Alistair Kent. Alistair is the chair of Genetic Alliance UK, and he will introduce our speakers and lead the discussion. Thank you very much for coming.
Well, thank you very much, Graham, and welcome everybody. The theme of this evening's conversation is, does the patient experience have value? And you might say, well, of course. And there's a lot of fashionable rhetoric around nothing about us without us, putting the patient at the heart of healthcare, and so on. But what I hope we can explore this evening is what does that mean in practice? How can we translate that rhetoric into practice? How can we make sure that the patient experience is central to research, to planning, and to service delivery in healthcare? So basically the format of this evening is that I shall say a few introductory remarks in a moment, then we will have our four speakers who will address the issues from their own perspectives. I'm going to assume that you've read their biographies in the leaflet that you have, because I don't want to take up time repeating what's there in your leaflets. Then at about 5:30, we will throw the conversation open for discussions. It says in your programme a chaired question and answer session. It won't be a question and answer session. It will be a conversation. There is more experience and expertise in the body of this rather magnificent baronial Gothic hall crossed with a Middle Eastern souk than there is on the platform here, although the experience on the platform is huge. And the purpose of the conversation is to try and bring that out and share it. And then in about an hour's time we will stop and we will adjourn for drinks and further conversation around the issues. So start will be, as I say, the four short presentations, and then it's your turn. And just because you're sitting at the back doesn't mean that I can't see you. And if I think it looks like you've got something to say, and believe me, I am expert at identifying people who've got something to say, even if they don't know it at the point at which I point the finger at them. So, you know, it would be much better if you indicated positively that you wanted to contribute without being unduly modest about the value of your input. So, let's think about it. The theme is, does the patient experience have value? What can patients bring to discussions around healthcare research and service delivery? Patients have unique insights. They can help us to understand when thinking about a particular condition or a disorder or a disease, what matters, not just what can be counted. For example, patients and families with Alzheimer's disease often say that the most important thing to them is maintenance of their ability to retain their independence for as long as possible. Yet for years, much research has been focused on preserving cognitive ability. And arguably, if you preserve somebody's insight into what they're losing without altering the progress of their condition, they become aware of their dependence for longer, and possibly you're not doing them any favours. They can bring you a picture of their disease or condition in the round, and that's particularly important with rare diseases, which may not be well understood and which may have features which are not obvious to scientists or clinicians. They can bring an insight into how interventions change lives. A friend of mine has Pompei's disease, which is a progressive metabolic disorder. There's a therapy for her. That therapy has increased her respiratory volume by 4%. Now, for most people, 4% increase in respiratory volume is insignificant, makes very little difference at all. For her, it means she can take the mask off her face that connects her to the ventilator. She can have a conversation. She can smile at you. She can engage with you socially in a much more normal way. It means she's more independent because she's no longer quite so afraid to go further than the length of the power cable from an electricity socket to power her respirator. So it gives an insight into the true value of small changes. Patients can also bring insights into how to make research or the planning and delivery of services fit our lives rather than expecting us to fit our lives into the pattern of service delivery or research that has been ordained by the experts. And that makes patient recruitment to research programs easier, it makes their retention more likely, it makes compliance with the protocol more effective. And in service delivery, you get fewer missed appointments because patients didn't attend, which means you get better use of resources and the maintenance of expertise. And finally, patients can bring an insight into the value of an intervention, not just the price of the intervention, which will lead to better decision making. But in order to make this happen, we need a partnership. We need to get away from the old kind of top-down cascade model where scientists discovered, industry developed, doctors prescribed, and patients took and were grateful, whether it worked or not, to a much more interactive, maybe moving from a cascade to a B-Day model of development, where things start at the bottom and work upwards. It'll stay with you there, won't it? Yes. But it is important that we don't ignore the voice of grassroots input, people who have that day-to-day experience. And so to explore how that happens, I'm going to move straight to our first speaker, Louise Lowcock. So Louise.
Right, I'm there. Hello, I'm Louise and I'm from Oxford and I'm a researcher, so I'm going to talk from a researcher-y perspective. And I think probably a number of us are going to say this kind of, does patient experience have value? Yes. Strange question. But does it have value for whom and for what? And I think I want to look at two different aspects of this. One is about patient experience as evidence, and one is about patient experience as a prompt for change. And they may or may not be the same thing. An analogy that I really like that comes from Carter, Klein and Day is this dials, alarm bells and tin openers. So dials are there to measure things and tell you how you're performing and make judgments. Tin openers open up cans of worms and alert people to thorny, complex issues that aren't easily measured and snappily condensed. And alarm bells kind of speak for themselves, really. The idea of an alarm bell is that the one single incident, you don't need lots of evidence. If one thing happens, that's one too many. So if one elderly woman is slapped in a care home and told she's a vicious old lady, as we saw on TV recently, you don't need to do a whole project about it. Patient experiences have a bit of an uneasy place in the evidence-based care discourse. Evidence-based medicine is great for all the right things, but it depends what question you're asking. So if you're asking, does a drug work, then a randomised controlled trial might be the right route to go down. But patient experience has been treated as kind of separate to research evidence. It's interesting and it's important, but it's not really research. Well, I would argue that you can be as research-based about patient experience as you can about other more statistical things. So patient surveys are one way to get at people's experiences, but I would question whether they're good at doing the tin opener job as opposed to the dial job. So this quotation from a study of patient experience in emergency departments suggests that questionnaires define the patient's response to fit with the predetermined issues that are considered important by the institutions that produce them. So they may come nowhere near the questions that patients think are important. Just an example of that from a study by some colleagues of mine at King's in London. They had the luxury of doing some interviews with people who had already completed the NHS inpatient survey, so they were able to compare an individual's responses on those two routes of data. So this is Betty, who is an 80-year-old woman, inpatient in hospital, and her response to the patient questionnaire on did she feel she was treated with respect and dignity? Yes, always. How do you rate the care you received? Excellent. big reveal, here's what she said in her interview. The other thing I didn't raise, and I should have done because it does annoy me intensely, the time you have to wait for a bedpan. Elderly people can't wait. If we want a bedpan, it's because we need it now. I just said to them, I need a bedpan, please, and it was so long bringing it out, it was too late. It's a very embarrassing subject, although they don't make anything of it. They just say, oh, well, it can't be helped if you're not well. And I thought, well, if only you'd brought the bedpan, you wouldn't have to strip the bed and I wouldn't be so embarrassed. So narratives like that, where people are given the space to talk about what their experience really was and how they felt about it, can get at these really rich accounts and deeper understandings of what matters to patients and families. Now, Betty is only one, but if we analyse collections of narratives, we can get lots of different perspectives and use them to learn more about what happens on the patient pathway rather than what we think happens or what we choose to think happens. We can see things through the patient's eyes rather than our own eyes, and we can recast the whole debate, redesign services, and use experience to prompt change. So this is about evidence and ideas, minds, our rational selves, and our hearts, trying to urge people that we need to rethink things, not just to measure them. And narrative persuasion is a way of achieving that. So we have, in my research group, a number of different studies which are available for people to use, and they class as high-quality evidence. I won't go into the detail, but if people want copies of my slides, you can have them, because I'd like to leave time. But I think part of the problem is that we collect data, we need to use it more for achieving change. And we've argued this in the BMJ recently, and the staff at Patient Opinion have also said it's about empowerment. It's not simply a rating site, it's not about choosing, it's about changing your care. So we've used our studies for a range of things: medical curriculum redesign, informing NICE and quality standards, health professional training. We've used it for experience-based co-design, where you use stories to encourage staff to think about change with the patients. We've used it for commissioning and informed national policy on end-of-life care. So I will just finish with Mike, if I can get this to work, talking about his experiences.
Privacy and dignity, I think, remains a challenge for the National Health Service, and much as with health information for patients, I did encounter some truly fantastic practice from some truly admirable practitioners, but I also had some exposure to the other end of the spectrum, people for whom privacy and dignity for patients is clearly not a particularly dominant concern. There were occasions when, whilst going through some pretty undignified procedures, either with the biopsy, for example, or the cystogram, for example, there were occasions when doors were flung open and people would just walk in and out and not introduce themselves, and they clearly had nothing to do with what was going on with me. And whilst I could tolerate that up to a point in a dentist's chair, if a dental nurse walks in and out, it's quite different from when, put bluntly, your ass is sticking up in the air. Whilst waiting in a crowded corridor full of other patients and their relatives, a clinician whom I had not encountered at any stage during the procedure itself, and who had her coat on ready to leave, stuck her head into the crowded corridor to shout in my general direction that I should expect to see blood in my semen for a period of time after this biopsy. Now, admittedly, that's useful information to have, I don't deny that, but the circumstances under which the information was delivered was far from ideal. It caused all heads to turn in my direction for what was, for me, the unique experience of being in a crowded corridor of a bunch of people who all were probably thinking about my semen. And I'm rather, they weren't. Now, that was a highly avoidable example. It would have taken literally just seconds longer for me to be taken to a room somewhere, or even just behind a curtain somewhere, for this information to be imparted to me with a little greater discretion. So I firmly believe that has nothing to do with resources. It has to do with personal choice, personal practice. It has to do with training, it has to do with culture. Perhaps it has also to do with managerial performance management practice, because these things go on because we work in a system that allows them to go on. And if we stopped allowing them to go on, then they wouldn't go on.
Thank you.
Thank you, Louise. Moving straight on, our next presentation comes from Jan Anderson.
Find it.
Good evening, everybody. Like others have said from the podium tonight, my thought was, is this a serious question or a trick question? And I'd say that for me, it's a no-brainer. And that's kind of a joke, because I work with people affected by neurological conditions. The reality, though, is that while patient experience is very, very important, it's quite hard to follow through and to use it in a meaningful way. My project, Neurological Voices, is not focused on inquiring of people about their personal experience, their patient experience of their condition, but rather it focuses on their experience of their treatment and care. The aim of Neurological Voices project is to empower those affected by neurological conditions to contribute to the development and improvement of neurological services. It's a project that's funded by the Scottish Government, and it's part of Healthcare Quality Improvement Agenda. And it was brought into the spotlight because there were clinical standards for neurological health services brought out in 2009. In general, the policy context has very much been about patient-centredness for over 10 years now, from the founding Our National Health Plan for Action, the Plan for Change, through all of these documents here, which I won't list for you, but you can see there's been a very strong strand on patient-centredness over the intervening years since 2001. This is a picture which shows some of the people I work with. So the people affected by neurological conditions are people with ataxia, dystonia, epilepsy, multiple sclerosis, Parkinson's disease, and a good number of rare conditions as well. Most of these are characterised as long-term conditions, so in some ways the trajectory of the condition is different to the patients or people with patient experience who are going to be up here tonight, possibly. And again, looking at policy, in 2009 it was recognised that long-term conditions affected a huge number of people, and it was important to have an action plan around them. It was recognised 2 million people in Scotland have long-term conditions, and in fact 2/3 of the population over 65 are affected by a long-term condition, with a quarter of people from 75 to 85 having 2+ long-term conditions. It was recognised that there's a need to integrate health, social care and voluntary sector services for these people who are living with these conditions for many years, and patient-centredness or person-centredness came more to the fore. The Long-Term Conditions Alliance for Scotland was set up and worked with the Scottish Government to look at the needs of people with long-term conditions. And it was very much more patient-centred than things had been in the past, with an emphasis on people, not patients, and self-management, which was looking at people taking more responsibility for their own health care. The Long-Term Conditions Alliance has now been renamed because of the legislation around health and social care. We've heard already about the difference between the medical model and more patient-centred models, and here's just some lists which look at the differences between these approaches. Again, I won't read through them in great difficulty, but we were talking about a kind of cascading down or your B-Day initially you came up with. But very much the approach taken with long-term conditions is much more holistic, looking at emotional well-being, psychology and spiritual well-being, more of a partnership model between clinicians and patients, with people seen as experts in their own condition. There's more of an emphasis on listening and on mobilising the person's resources for healing rather than prescribing treatment and cure. 2 minutes. Okay, getting there. I'm going to hand over now, well not hand over, I'm going to bring forward some of the voices of some of the people I work with. So I've trained in a variety of health boards in Scotland and worked with people with different neurological conditions, to equip them to liaise with the health board and look at neurological health services. And Roddy is somebody from Glasgow who cares for his wife with Parkinson's, and he highlights some of the issues. Again, I won't read through this here, but so he's noticing that there is very much a standard medical model still in process, and that conversations with patients are constrained by the standard model that's applied. But he's also recognising that patients and people who use services need to change as well, that we need to understand that we need to get better at communicating our condition to health services so that there's better communication overall. So some of the challenges that we face are to do with the entrenchment of the medical model, an imbalance of power that's evident and perceived between clinicians and patients. There are issues to do with communication. I'm equipping people to attend meetings around their experience of their treatment and care, and there's a huge amount of jargon, whether it's management jargon or jargon to do with the NHS. And in meetings, the paperwork for the meetings can be absolutely huge and very inaccessible to people. There are also issues of just accessing, getting to meetings, and it's really important that we hear from patient voices of people who can't make it from the bedside table to the table for meetings. So how can we articulate patient experience in a way that's useful to others? It seems important that encounters become more person-centred, that we listen well. The question said, how can we articulate patient experience? But it seems to me that it's not for us to articulate it, but rather to create spaces so that people can be heard and to facilitate communication in those places. My background is in speech and language therapy, actually, and then I've also studied and practiced person-centred counselling, so this is all very important to me. And some of the ways that we make communication more accessible in our training are using things like talking maths, where you give people cards with lots of alternatives on them and get them to kind of map out their experience of a situation rather than just having a free conversation, so it supports communication. And also when we're preparing groups for engaging with the NHS in meetings, we look at developing guidelines which will make them more accessible to those people. So for example, what they would need from the chair to help them participate, that the agenda should be short, that the papers should have lots of white space and bullet points and not be too dense, and that there need to be specific support strategies to get people in. So it's not about people with conditions sort of changing to fit into our meetings, it's more about the meetings being adapted so that people can express themselves more fully. We also say there should be more than one patient at any meeting, so for solidarity, and that there should be debriefs between meetings. Again, I'm going to return to patients briefly, and I must be coming up to time. Yeah. So just hear from 2 or 3 voices briefly here. So Mari here is acknowledging issues to do with communication. She's saying at the beginning, when she got her MS diagnosis, she felt there was a lot assumed about the knowledge that she would have. And yet later on, when she felt she'd gathered a lot of knowledge, that knowledge wasn't wanted so much. She had a lovely thing to say about how she feels when she participates in support groups. Patterns emerge in people's experience, and that caused me to choose this picture of birds flocking together. So it was the experience of many that created patterns which taught them about their conditions. Patrick's saying something here specifically about the Neurological Voices programme. It's recognised by the Scottish Government and implemented in health boards, and he feels it empowers people and gives them credibility in the eyes of professionals. That patient groups and support groups can learn a lot and support each other in relation to their condition, but here they're getting involved in strategic and planning processes, and certainly Patrick's from Lothian, they really have been listened to seriously here. In fact, this is Jane, who is an NHS manager in Lothian, and I'll just read what she said. The vision we have drafted, which is their strategic plan for neurological services in Lothian, was a vision of a way of working, not for better services. There, the Neurological Voices, kind patient approach led us to a much clearer vision for services. They are excellent at keeping a focus on what's important. Their discussions highlight how dysfunctional our rhetoric and rule of thumb assumptions about patients' views are, particularly when it comes to the use of resources. The last word goes to Jill with epilepsy, who says, it's essential that patients and carers provide lived experience at all levels. Our voices need to be heard, ringing throughout the national and local frameworks. You won't get there without us. Okay. Thank you.
And now we move on to Heather Coudert.
Thank you very much, and good evening. This is my only really pretty slide, and I love it. Ever since I was myself a patient in the notorious and eventually discredited 1990 study comparing women with breast cancer who went to the Bristol Cancer Help Centre for complementary care with others who didn't, I've been involved in one way or another with medical research. This is what we found at Bristol. And then, first of all, some of us in the Bristol study formed a support group and challenged the researchers, made a television programme and wrote a book. Originally with broadsheet headlines such as "Women who go to Bristol die sooner" and "Death from complementary medicine." That was actually in the BMJ. It was hard work to correct the record, since the paper had been published in the prestigious Lancet. But doctors and statisticians wrote many letters challenging the results. The Lancet's statistical peer review procedures were improved, and we were finally successful in restoring the good name of the Bristol Centre, now Pennybron Cancer Care, which has gone on from strength to strength and now even offers free treatment after some fantastic fundraising. This campaign brought us to the attention of the British Medical Journal, and I was invited to join their editorial board as its first patient representative. An article that the editor, Dr. Richard Smith, and I wrote in 1995 summed up our ambitions for patient contributions to medical research. Our ideal has still not been fully realised, though some progress has been made. We don't just want to be brought in to put the patient consent form into plain English, though that is important. As Dr. Smith and I said in 1995, patients should help to set the research agenda. For instance, women with breast cancer want more research on quality of life, environmental and psychosocial issues, and the optimum dose of radiotherapy to control the tumour but cause minimal damage to healthy tissues. Only this year, this latter topic came up again after the 10-year results of the START trial about the standardisation of radiotherapy for breast cancer reported late effects only from the physician's point of view, not that of the patient's. However, we did manage to get a letter into the Lancet pointing this out. That's the long version. Those are the main points. It is true that in the last 28 years, since my own experience of breast cancer, attitudes to patients have been transformed. When I underwent radiotherapy, I was not allowed to put up a notice in the clinic about a cancer support group. Oh, we don't mention that word here. And it is true that researchers applying for funding are now required to show evidence of patient involvement in their proposals. However, such involvement can be meaningful or tokenistic. Researchers can genuinely wish to hear the patient's point of view, or they can be patronising. I have experienced both kinds of involvement. However, I'd like to tell you about a recent experience that I have found genuinely useful and encouraging. It concerns the updating of a Cochrane systematic review of physiotherapy for stroke. Which I took part in as a carer for my husband, who had a stroke in 2007. What struck me from the very start was that this particular team in Glasgow was genuinely interested in contributions from consumers to the task of updating this review. The important task is to involve consumers from the start, not simply bring them in towards the end of the procedure in an add-on exercise to lend legitimacy. In this case, we had 3 meetings at which researchers, clinicians and consumers, 3 patients and 1 carer, had equal voices and equal votes. There was one particularly important decision to be made. It turned out that in earlier reviews, the large body of relevant Chinese work had not been taken on board. In fact, over half the studies in this field were Chinese. Our personal experience played a crucial part in convincing the group that these studies should be included. One stroke patient had experienced Chinese healthcare when in China, and I had benefited from acupuncture for the long-term adverse effects of radiotherapy. We both felt that the Chinese contribution was extremely important. So the final review includes the Chinese studies, and I'm sure is the better for it. We presented this work at the Royal College of Nursing Research Conference in Glasgow in March, and in April ran a workshop at the Cochrane Collaboration Symposium in Manchester with the theme, Users Should Be Involved Right from the Start of Every Cochrane Review. The title was Making Cochrane Evidence Useful, giving patients, carers and clinicians a real say in a Cochrane review. So why is it so important to consult patients and carers when doing this kind of work? Too often, the agendas of the drug companies may distort the evidence. The contribution of consumers may help to make sure that research is grounded in real-life experience. They may also bring other skills to bear on the job to be done. My own experience as an editor has often come in useful in disentangling dense prose. And my husband, as a retired actuary, is a lot better at statistics than most doctors. Finally, if you would like to be further involved in healthcare research as a layperson, these are the organisations that can help. That's the Chief Scientist's Office in Scotland, and that's the Involve organisation in England. I'll just put that, sorry, I'll put that back again, if you want to copy it out. Thank you.
And finally, last but by no means least, Jill Hollis.
Well, thank you very much. This is a rather strange experience for me because in the 1980s I actually took Ken Mason's class in medical jurisprudence at Old College. As a student, from a student's perspective, it was absolutely fascinating, but I never imagined I'd be back here 28 years later talking about it from a patient perspective. I actually became a patient only 2 months after graduating from Old College. My right lung collapsed, and 5 years and as many lung collapses later, I was diagnosed with a lung condition with a very long name. I won't spend time going over it. It's known as LAM, thankfully, which makes it a lot easier. But the main points are, LAM is an extremely rare disease. It only affects women and is found in around 5 women in every million. And the second point about it, it's a progressive disease. It's chronic and it has no known cure. In my own case, a lung transplant 10 years ago saved my life, and I'm extremely fortunate to be living well, both with my transplant and with LAM. Over these 10 years, I've spent an increasing amount of time as an advocate, a patient advocate, so clearly I believe that patient experience has value. What's driving me is a combination of altruism. I want to help in any way I can, in part to say thank you for the care I've received, but also a belief that I can help, because I know how much other patients helped and inspired me. The best example I can give is of my 5-day transplant assessment at the Freeman Hospital in Newcastle. The medical team were brilliant at giving me lots of information. But one afternoon, they arranged for a lady with LAM, who had had a transplant 2 years before me, to come and see me. The energy with which she just strode into the ward is something that I'll always remember, and that alone answered so many of the questions that I might have about how life after a transplant might be. I mentioned that LAM is a very rare disease, and as patients, I think we find that most doctors, even respiratory specialists, are unfamiliar with our disease. We have a national centre for LAM now, and LAM patients were actually very involved in lobbying for that. But outside of it, I think it's fair to say that many LAM patients are better informed about their disease than their doctors. The internet has made it much easier to find out about a rare disease, but other patients remain a primary source of information and support. An early study in the 1990s called LAM the lonely disease. Today, in contrast, technology and particularly social media have made it far easier to contact other patients and interact in groups, both locally and internationally. And in addition to sharing information, this has helped alleviate the isolation that sufferers of rare disease feel. I also said that LAM was a chronic disease. Doctors treat disease, but treatment options can only go so far. However, there remains considerable scope to guide patients on how to live well with their disease or their chronic condition. And that's where I think that patient experience is of particular importance. Other patients can give tips and advice based on their real experience. In the case of LAM, the same topics come up time and time again. How to deal with breathlessness, panic attacks, anxiety, how to get access to portable oxygen, how to deal with the side effects of drugs or oxygen therapy. They're all practical tips that can make the biggest difference to the quality of people's lives on a day-to-day basis. We obviously use a wide variety of media to share this information between patients. Sometimes someone's asked a question on a forum which prompts an absolute deluge of responses, and that's wonderful, because in addition to getting the question answered and some practical advice, the questioner can see, wow, there's lots of other people out there just like me, and that is incredibly reassuring. So far, I've concentrated on the information flow between patients, so I'll finish on the information flows from patients to doctors and scientific researchers. That is, whether the medical profession can actually learn from patient experience. I still think it's common for some doctors, particularly specialists, to treat the physical symptoms only, ignoring the emotional and psychological issues which may cause the greatest distress on a day-to-day basis. Certainly with LAM, at every opportunity, every review of guidelines, every review of patient literature, we remind doctors of the importance of considering both the physical and the emotional issues associated with the disease. Certainly there's a welcome trend towards including patient views and decisions about their treatment and care. But as Louise said, the collection of these views must be done very carefully. I'm currently involved in 2 projects to collect patient experience data by questioning. Thank you. One's for the European Respiratory Society to feed into a scientific session on LAM at their annual conference, and one on the Scottish Transplant Group, who are planning transplant services through to the year 2020. I said here, and written down, that wording and design of both questionnaires definitely benefited from the input of patients. I think that's actually code for we rewrote it. It had very much been set from the doctor's perspective, and it did need turned around quite substantially. But obviously, if the questions reflect an understanding of the patient experience and process, then hopefully the answers will be more meaningful. Finally, I don't know how specific it is to our LAM community, but although, or possibly because we are small in number, we're a very tightly knit community that stretches across the world and across the patient-doctor research divide. The discovery of the first drug to treat LAM, if not cure it, was written up in the New England Journal of Medicine in 2011. Significantly, alongside the trial results was an editorial on the collaboration between LAM patient groups, their doctors, and the researchers that led to the successful trial. The editorial said, This is true bench to bedside and back research, a good model to emulate. That does suggest that patient experience has value and seems a very appropriate place to finish. Thank you.
Right, now it's your turn. Just switch this on.
Hello? Is that working?
There is also a microphone in the hall, which for those of you who don't feel confident about the power of your own vocal cords, please, anyway, yes, gentleman in the front row. First out the box.
Hi, I'm a medical practitioner, and this year the National Health Service is going to celebrate its 66th birthday. And I have the privilege of being part of the NHS for more than 3 decades. And as you said already in the beginning in your speech, 40 years ago, a patient comes to see a general practitioner. Well, he will tell his symptoms, he will make a diagnosis, he is given a prescription, and he go home. And you presume that he is living happily ever after until he comes back to see you 6 months after, just to tell you he never took the medicine because he has serious side effects. You see, because at that time there was no procedure in place to assess the patient experience. Nobody will ask him to come back to tell us what he felt after taking that medicine. But I have been through all the changes which have happened over the 40 years, how medicine has evolved, and we are taking more and more account of patient experience. But we are not perfect, because somebody said among the speakers that we design questionnaires, and those questionnaires, we design them and ask the patients their values. Like in general practice, there is a general practice patient satisfaction survey, and the question has been designed by a medical professor to ask his patients after he sees the doctor, and then he will rate them. But have you ever asked that patient that what you would want designing that questionnaire? What is your view? I mean, we do clinical research, and I'm a researcher as well, so I'm wearing so many hats, you see. I mean, there may be things that be important to the patient. So we have to go back to the patient and ask them, what is important to you? Nowadays, patients are living longer, like 75 plus, they are living 10 years longer, and they are living with more long-term conditions, you see. Now, a patient has got 5 conditions. He has got hypertension, diabetes, asthma, something else, heart disease. Now, he goes to see a respiratory doctor, and he will check his asthma and everything, and that's it. And he says, by the way, yesterday my blood sugar was very high, doctor. Oh, that's not my problem. You have to see the diabetes.
Can you come to the...
You have to go and see the diabetes doctor, you see. I think the time has come when there should be a stepwise approach for the management with patients with multiple conditions. Sit down with him and ask him, well, you have got all these conditions. What are your priorities? How would you like to live your life? And then make a plan for him in a stepwise fashion. And there is a guideline in America which is devised by the American Geriatric Society, and they are trying to do exactly the same. And I think that has got lots of benefits, because I can then decide what is my priority. Yeah. And then I can give my experience to the medical profession, and then they can, depending on that, plan my care.
I'm going to have to stop you there because I'm anxious to give everybody a fair crack of the whip. But would anybody on the panel like to address this question of multiple morbidities and the fact that as we get older, we don't just have one condition, and how do we involve the patient experience of living with multiple problems? I hope it's switched on.
It's just about impossible with the 7 minutes for a consultation. I don't know.
Right. Yes?
I would like to agree with what you're saying. So you're saying that in order to be truly person-centred, we need to think about the person's, all of the things they're living with and what their priorities might be. And certainly my experience of the people I work with is, yes, you know, they may have more than one condition. They go and see somebody, they have things that may pertain to that condition, but I'll have to refer you to a different person around that. And it'd be nice if there was somebody who could more help them to have a more unified sense of their care. But certainly, it's great what you're saying, that you have really seen that journey, and you can see that there is more collaboration and negotiation, and that patients and users' voices are being taken on board much more. So I'd agree with what you're saying. I'm not sure who the professional would be that would take on that role, and whether it would be the GP. Maybe not, maybe they're too busy. I'm not sure who it would be, but I think it's a very good point.
Yeah, gentleman over there.
Hi there. Recently, the Cabinet Secretary announced that there will be proposals brought forward by the end of the year to strengthen the patient voice. I was just wondering how the panel feel that could be achieved.
Who'd like to pick up on?
Specifically said the patient voice should be strengthened at every level in Scotland.
You're a speech therapist, you know about strengthening the patient voice, don't you?
I'll say something about this. My project, which is called Neurological Voices, has been functioning since 2011, and it grew out of these clinical standards for neurological services, and it was preceded by a lot of voices work with people who've had strokes, people with heart conditions, and people with respiratory. So the whole voices movement is bigger, and I think it's gaining momentum. But interestingly, my project, we're not quite sure whether it's going to get ongoing funding, and I think there are resource issues. The way I operate is that we work with groups of people, and the model would be that we'd like to have groups meeting locally in a health board area, and that takes resources from the health board. People are able to talk about their priorities when we meet face to face, and I'm not sure to what extent they're thinking of the patient voice being that they can consult people, that they can have registers of people who, you know, they can ask for their opinion, but without the sort of getting people together to meet. That's a concern I have, because people with neurological conditions have cognitive issues, memory issues, all sorts of things, and actually coming together and doing things face to face is a really good way. But certainly, I can see that we've had people active locally, and then we now have a national neurology advisory group which has a whole pile of work streams, and they want to have patient voices on all of those work streams. So I think we're trying, it's good.
What about the rest of you? Have any of you got ideas about how you'd like to see the patient voice? Gentleman in the front row here.
Yes, when the gentleman said the Cabinet Secretary is issuing this thing, I had a good laugh. We've heard this every year for I don't know how long. It goes nowhere. We used to have patient partnership forums, which were supposed to lead in. Edinburgh has abolished them. I'm a member of the only one, which is done by a lot of us who are ex-PPFs, the Edinburgh Health Forum. We set it up. Most of us are community councillors and, you know, link in with the NHS. Well, we try to. But the problem is actually much bigger. I'm a long-term condition patient myself with glaucoma. I'm on the Scottish Intercollegiate Guidance Network working group drawing up new guidelines for glaucoma diagnosis and aftercare. I'm the only patient for Scotland. and the medics just don't understand how to engage with patients and communities. They're clueless. But more picking up, you have to look at the thing from top to bottom. A lot of medical people, A, don't know how to engage. B, there's no infrastructure to allow them to do it, because you've got management. Management and medics quite often have got different outlook. And therein lies a major problem. I see this with the eye care. From a patient's point of view, I know what it's like to suffer suicidal depression from Timoctal, a beta blocker. I self-diagnosed that, basically, and fortunately, I'm still here. But trying to get that, we're now going to produce a patient guideline, done by patients for patients. And we're fighting SIGN to get, in the main guidelines, a bigger patient contribution. But you come up against, well, that's not the way we do it. And I'm saying, well, it's jolly well going to happen. So there is a big, there's a lot of willing people there, but there is a bigger attitude in the health service that needs to be addressed. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That's very helpful. I think you highlight a major point about the kind of inertia of the system. You know, it's like trying to turn the supertanker, isn't it? So you move the wheel, and then many miles down the road, the front of the ship starts to wobble in what you hope is the direction, isn't it?
Could I just say something about involving patients in research teams? Because some people do it very well, and others do it pretty badly. Now, the Health Technology Assessment Programme does require evidence of consultation with patients before it will give you any money to do your research. I'm not sure whether that holds good for other research bodies, but it seems to me that anybody who is undertaking research should have, you know, they should have a kind of module of how to do it and how to engage with patients. But I'm sure that's pie in the sky at the moment. But it really is important, and as I'm experienced for myself, it improves the work, it really does. Particularly if you get the patients in at the very beginning and you don't just tap them on at the end. So that's a suggestion, that we should make sure that all research teams do it and do it properly. Thank you.
Just I think it's the doing it properly that is the problem, and the risk of tokenism when people just issue these edicts without any kind of real engagement is the problem. Some of it, I think, comes from the culture of evidence-based medicine, and it is difficult to interpolate a new kind of evidence into that and give it the status of the other kinds of research evidence. So that's one of the things I wanted to kind of get across. But I think also there is the power of getting people in a room face to face, actually. As you were saying, you know, Jan, when you get people face to face, a different conversation happens. And we need to do much more of that rather than just sort of this tokenistic, have one person at the table. You need proper, equalised relationships and discussions, which involves having lots of patients in the room so they don't get voted down kind of thing.
But that requires resources. And of course, the health service will always argue it's a nice thing to do, but then it'll mean that we can do less treating. How do we get around that kind of dilemma, and it's an artificial dilemma that is posed?
Well, they could start by not spending some of the stuff that they're spending on quality improvement in the wrong ways and transfer it into doing it in the right ways. Most trusts actually do have whole quality improvement teams and people dedicated to this stuff, but what are they actually doing? Are they doing it in a properly engaged way would be my counter.
What about anybody, is this a suggestion, a response, or are you moving on to a new point? Doesn't matter either way, but...
It's a bit of both.
Yeah. Can you wait for the microphone? It's just coming. Thanks.
Well, one easy way to get more patients involved in chronic disease research is have chronic disease patients or long-term patients with chronic disease as researchers. I'm one of them. I research chronic disease. I have chronic eustachian tube dysfunction, which means it's really hard for me to fly, and if you put your hand over your mouth, I can't tell that you're speaking. But I do wonder, from both my research and from the fact that I have a chronic disease, how do we deal with patient treatment fatigue? You go to dozens of doctors and therapists and medical specialists, and if you're involved with research, then you have interviews and 3 or 4 different surveys. How do we deal with that and still be patient-centered?
Well, I agree absolutely. And sometimes I think we spend too much time reinventing the wheel, asking people what matters to them, when actually we know damn well what matters to people. What we don't do is act on it. So we need to make better use of the sources of existing evidence on what matters to people. Now, there will always be things where, like when a very rare condition, there will be specific things that you do have to ask people about. But we could gather that experience and then use it for lots of different purposes rather than having to kind of keep asking the same questions, because that's the loop we get stuck on. We ask the questions and then we never do anything with it. I don't know.
Thank you. Are there other researchers in the audience who'd like to chip in about how your experience of structuring things to keep people engaged and make it possible for them to continue to participate actively in your research? Jill.
Thanks, Alice.
Anytime, anytime.
I just want to thank all the speakers. Now you've given me this opportunity as well for a really great discussion. I think I've got a couple of things that was going on in my head while everyone was speaking. One is kind of like the relationship and the difficulties that I've had personally as a researcher when doing what is now known as public engagement, if you like, and some of the obstacles and challenges around engaging with the public seems to be similar to some of the obstacles and challenges that engaging with patients and their experiences have. One of the things that I was sad to hear about by the gentleman at the front was the fact that the public partnership groups were being disbanded, because they were actually a resource that we used quite a lot when we were thinking about genetic databases. And there is also an issue, of course, about participant fatigue. And what happened was we continually went back to public partnership groups in order to assess and gather their views around genetic databases. And eventually the guys were like fatigued. They were like, we're not playing anymore, Jill. You've asked us this question and you've asked us it like 10 times and we're still giving you the same answer. But I think for me one of the greatest challenges as a researcher is the fact that, and my colleague here, Teresa's here as well, is the fact that often one of the difficulties is trying to get the research through in order to approach patients, to speak to patients about technologies, and ethics research committees, research ethics committees can actually be very difficult to try and get your research shown, to get your research sort of put through. And there actually are, I believe, patient members on those committees as well. So is there something going wrong there? Are researchers doing something wrong there that maybe can be improved? Or I've maybe been a little bit provocative on that question.
Never accused you of being provocative, Jill. Gentleman in the front is Becca. You were nodding at Robert. Would you like to nod orally as well as visually on that?
I think in research, and this is quite a generalization, but follow the money. Unfortunately, far too much research now it's dictated. I feel sorry for, I'm involved in medical research and have been for decades. But the trouble now is publish. It's quantity over quality. The pressures on researchers are very serious. And quite often, many researchers would like to engage constructively with patients, but this is not really regarded as a good career move. And I know, in classic, in the ethics committees, I know, am I allowed to mention the you-know-what? Yes. One of the people on the top table and was involved in something, and anyway, it was a research where there were serious questions about the efficacy of this. This was flagged up with the ethics committees who ignored it. Indeed, it is very worrying. But somehow this has gone through all the crash barriers and it's trundling on quite happily. And yet, at the end of the day, the patient contribution has been virtually ignored. And that is, I think you've got what I do is what I'm doing in the eye care, because I'm also part of the eye care integration, this Vision 2020, on the patient. But I look at the whole patient journey. I want to know, are the medics fully supported? What pressures are they under? And researchers, each segment must be, in a sense, stress tested, because it just takes one broken coupling and a lot of it disappears, or unfortunate research gets into the public domain and then 2 or 3 years down the line it's found out the poor patients who are suffering, it really shouldn't have got out. And I think this is, to me, a major problem. And again, where the patients can, the voice is so constructive. But a lot of medics, and in management, they don't know. We have a whole range of stuff, supposedly patient engagement and all this sort of thing. It doesn't work. It's like complaints. You've got all these suites of documents, but you try making a complaint even like NHS Lothian. I was asked to go on to a thing called the Local Advisory Group. Out of 20 people, 6 turned up. I got sacked after 3 days. I was told there was far too many people in the group. I checked with the other 5, and they never heard. After 15 months, no one had heard anything. But someone had ticked the box, we've engaged, and that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, yeah. I'm conscious of time. I'm going to ask in a moment, did you want to respond to that?
Yes, just very quickly. Ian has been trying to tell a story, which is actually my story, about a really unsatisfactory episode of, quote, patient engagement, unquote. I didn't want to mention it because I was trying to be positive. I was trying to tell you about the lovely work we did in Glasgow, which really was an excellent example of how to do it. This particular piece of work was done in Edinburgh, and it's not a very good example of how to do it. And when we started asking awkward questions, we were kind of shunted to the side. So, you know, there are good ways and bad ways of doing it, and it would be lovely if it was always done the good way, but I'm afraid it's not always. Thank you.
Right, thank you. I'm going to be wrapping up in a moment, and in wrapping up, I'm going to ask each of our 4 panellists for a closing take-home sentence. 1 sentence, no more, and I'm going to do it in reverse order to your speakers, so you can be prepared. But I'm very conscious that nobody from this third of the hall has had the opportunity to speak, and I know that you're all itching to contribute to what's been a fascinating debate. So who'd like to break the duck for this side of the hall and respond to some of the issues that... Gentleman at the back, you've obviously got something to say, I think. Yes, that's you, yeah. What have you heard today that has made you think? Yeah, okay, we've got a volunteer here.
Hello, thanks very much. Can we make better and smarter use of social media in the context of clinical trials, and if so, how might we go about doing this? So, for example, you know, patients who are currently enrolled in a trial sharing their experience freely with people in that same country or other countries, and what would be the possible drawbacks of doing this, maybe from a drug company's perspective? Thanks.
See, I knew that this side of the room had interesting and useful things today to say. Thank you very much for that. I think that's a very stimulating idea to take forward on another occasion. But I'm conscious that we have run over, and that I'm sure you're all cursing me for keeping you from the drink and the canapes. I'm told the canapes are delicious and well worth waiting for. But before we close, final thoughts from our panellists. Jill, what's your take-home message for everybody?
Thank you. One point that just came to me during some of the discussion is I think we're actually very lucky in Scotland to have a smaller scale, and therefore, and this reflects my own experience with transplantation, but I have seen people getting together in the same room to discuss policy where patient needs and the patient voice is listened to and acted upon. So that's been very encouraging for me, and as I say, I'm not sure how much, to what extent that is, because we are dealing with smaller numbers in Scotland.
Heather.
I've actually written it out. Involve patients from the start of a research project in its design, have at least 2 of them on your panel, more if possible, and don't choose your favourite patient, because they don't like to jog the hand that's got the cannula in it.
Thank you. Jan.
I'm a little bit somehow I didn't see that coming to me right now. What shall I say? I suppose I'd like to say that I do see encouraging signs of change towards person-centredness. I was at an NHS Scotland event in November, and I think there's been another one since, and it was something called the Person-Centred Health and Care Collaborative. A massive, massive event, and the keynote speaker was a man called David Riley, who certainly has the ear of Scottish Government and is extremely person-centred and takes a very holistic approach. And I think it's kind of thinking about what you were saying, that I think we are fortunate in Scotland. I think there are quite progressive approaches to this, but I do fear that there's a lot of tick boxing going on, and we really, really need to continue to challenge that.
And Louise.
Okay, I didn't talk about it very much, but I'm a massive fan of a process called experience-based co-design as a way of breaking down the defensiveness and giving staff a renewed sense of why they joined the NHS, because they didn't join to be non-patient centred, but they forget about it in the grind of daily work. And I think sometimes using those stories to reinvigorate them and help them get back to their real values, it can be the most powerful way forward.
Great, thank you very much, and thank you.
Use these semicolons.
Great. Well, I hope you'll agree with me that I think this has been a fascinating conversation, and I'd like to thank not just our panelists, but all of you in the audience for contributing not just questions, but comments and insights. I think that has been very important to recognise that whether we're professionals, or whether we're patients, or whether we're carers, or which hat we happen to be wearing at the time, the input from patients to the design and the delivery of research and healthcare can make a qualitative and a quantitative difference to the outputs that we experience. To end on a really, really upbeat note, to send you to the drink with a lift in your hearts, I want to remind you what a very good friend of mine says on occasions like this. This is an issue that matters to all of us intently. Whether we currently define ourselves as professionals, as policymakers, as academics, as clinicians, as researchers, or whatever. Because good health ultimately is only an incomplete diagnosis. And when we are patients, we want to have a say in the management of our condition. We want to feel that our concerns are heard, that our ideas are listened to, and that we will have a part in determining how, when those comorbidities hit us, we can expect to receive healthcare that fits around our lives, rather than being compelled to force our lives into slots that are framed by the healthcare service. So I'd like to thank Graham and the team at the Mason Institute for providing the opportunity for us to have this conversation this evening, to thank you all for coming, and to tell you that the drinks are in the loft bar, which I'm reliably informed you go out of here and to the left, and it appears like you're entering a cupboard, which is a bit like going through to platform 9 3/4 at King's Cross Station to catch the Hogwarts Express. You go through the cupboard and it will take you to a magical world of drinking canapes. So thanks to our speakers, thanks to Graham and his team, and thank you for your contribution. So.